Hello, in this video I'm going to give a little background to Richard Feynman, pictured here with his bongo drums. He was a keen bongoer. You've probably heard of Feynman mainly related to the Feynman diagrams that are named after him, but there's a lot more to him than just those, although that in itself is an astonishing achievement. So Feynman, he was born at the end of the First World War. American physicist, born in New York to a Jewish family, although he throughout his life always considered himself to be an atheist. So his family had Polish and Russian heritage, and the Jewish heritage did restrict him in some ways. I mean, he initially applied to go to Columbia University, but they had a cap on the number of Jewish students that they were willing to admit at the time. So he ended up going to MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is hardly great suffering going to somewhere like that. He initially went to study maths, switched to engineering because he thought maths was too abstract and he wanted something which is a bit more hands-on, a bit more real world. But then he found that engineering was too far the other way, so then switched to physics, which he found to be somewhere in between, which of course by and large it is. So he graduated in 1939. He then moved on to Princeton to complete his PhD in 1942. And it was part of his PhD where he had this insight of describing positrons as behaving like electrons that are traveling backwards in time. That's a feature which we've seen in Feynman diagrams of pointing the arrow on antimatter as going backwards in time rather than forwards in time, although it was still another 5 or 6 years until after the Second World War that he actually developed those diagrams. Something that certainly got in the way between completing his PhD at Princeton and then his later work was, as with most of the team at Princeton at the time, he became part of the Manhattan Project. So he was moved over to Los Alamos. His wife, who was very sick at the time with TB, came with him. He had he wasn't, he was still very young at the time. He had a significant but not the most prominent role in the Manhattan Project, but he was certainly there and involved. And then after the Second World War concluded, he then worked at Cornell University, went to Caltech, and it was at Caltech that he delivered his famous series of Feynman lectures, which are well worth. I'd highly recommend having a look at those. You'd have to go through the whole lot of them. I mean, surprise, surprise, there are a lot of lectures, but he presents things in a very different way. And I think you can see that in so much as those lectures haven't, as far as I'm aware, haven't been picked up as being a standard way of teaching physics in universities, either at the time or later on. But they are tremendously enlightening in having a slightly different slant on thinking about physics. So yeah, well worth having a look at those, either to listen to the lectures or look at the books which are available online. I mean, Feynman, he was noted for being a particularly charismatic speaker, he was atypical. He was different to the usual stereotype of what a physicist is like. Alongside his lectures and his Feynman diagrams, I mean, the Feynman diagrams was part of his restructuring of quantum mechanics and quantum electrodynamics in particular. So by the time he was working on them, quantum electrodynamics had been going since the 1920s. So it was good up to a point, but it had certain limitations. It was showing weaknesses by the time it got into the 1940s, and Feynman fixed a lot of those. He restructured it, and he created calculation rules which were much simpler, and these were based around his diagrams and how he was treating everything as particles rather than trying to look at the wave particle duality. So he simplified and restructured things a lot, and those effects are still felt to today. I mean, a lot of that stuff is still used. Um, he also did work on superfluidity of such as supercooled liquid helium and such like. So yeah, he covered a lot of different areas in particle physics and quantum mechanics, and as such, he was then awarded Nobel Prize for Physics in 1965 for his work in quantum electrodynamics. He also, near the end of his life, he came to public prominence again because he was involved in a committee that was investigating the Challenger space shuttle disaster in the mid 1980s. So yeah, he became prominent then, and he died relatively young in 1988, just short of his 70th birthday, through I think it was it stomach cancer? I think it might have been. He certainly had cancer anyway, and he had some famous last words or near last words of "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Um, but yeah, that sort of again encapsulates the sort of charismatic way that he carried himself, and yeah, the way he expressed himself. So yeah, another remarkable man who will be long remembered.